until she retired in 2018, and I use the word retired. I should put that in quotes. I can't tell that she's slowed down any at all. I think she's probably busier than she ever was. We just don't have the pleasure of seeing her here at the office. She is a longtime member of the Humanities Montana Speakers Bureau, and she is an expert storyteller who's delighted audiences of all ages and interest across the state. She's a 2011 recipient of the Governor's Award for Humanities and award-winning author of many books and articles on diverse topics. She is best known for her spine-tingling, well-researched stories on Montana haunted places. And of course, we are here tonight to talk about this new book that's a collaborative effort between Jon and Ellen on Helena's hidden history. And Jon Axline is the longtime historian at the Montana Department of Transportation. When not sweating over the state's historic roads and bridges, he conducts cultural resource surveys and writes the MDT's roadside historical and geological interpretive markers. He's a regular contributor to Montana, the Magazine of Western History, and he is also the author of Conveniences Sorely Needed, Montana's Historic Highway Bridges, and the editor of Montana's Historical Highway Markers, Taming Big Sky Country, A History of Montana Transportation from Trails to Interstates. And the Beartooth Highway, A History of America's Most Beautiful Drive. Jon lives in Helena with his wife and 4 dogs. So without further ado, welcome Jon and Ellen.
Yes. I think we're going to have to share the mic. Is that all right with everybody? That way I don't have to wear this stupid thing.
Oh, you do because she's
I still do?
you. Yeah.
Well, I thought I was lucking out there for a minute. After listening to Kirby's introduction, this woman really intimidates me. But we've done I think we worked pretty well together on this. Our first collaboration.
I think we've known each other for, 25 years at least?
30, more than 30.
That's
I think,
true.
yeah. So we've always talked about doing something together, but we've never done it. It was nice to finally do something.
Yeah.
And so I think we wanted to talk a little bit about the background to where this book came from. How many of you remember the old More from the Quarries of Last Chance Gulch newspaper columns? They were great, weren't they?
How do we get it to advance there? This is not working.
No, we're
Technologically challenged tonight.
Yeah. Huh. I don't know. You one of these?
I don't know.
I'm afraid to push too much.
I know.
Well, this intimidates us as
Here
well.
goes Diane. She's going to help us. Yeah, we don't know why it's not.
Yeah.
It's stuck.
Oh, this is not PowerPoint, is it?
Yeah.
Next. Let's go with an N.
What did you hit?
N? Okay.
N, okay,
All
for
right.
next
Oh,
time.
now it'll work.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Thank you.
All right.
We're good now.
Yay.
Yay. Yay for Diane.
Well, way back in the, what was it, about 1995, a bunch of us met at Rich Rader's home, which was not too far from here, and Rich and Cher Justo and some others had an idea about maybe doing a weekly history column for the Helena Independent Record. And we, I don't know how many were there of us?
About 6 of us, I think.
Six, and we all kind of thought that was a great idea, and we all had different interests in Helena history, and we thought this would give us a good chance to kind of explore those different subjects, maybe dispel some misinformation that had been circulating for many years, and tackle some new things about Helena that maybe a lot of people didn't know about. And for the next, 4 years?
5.
4 or 5 years? I'm glad you're here. I'm way off. We did a weekly column. The group of us from 5 grew to, I don't know how many.
6 or 7 or
Yes.
8 sometimes, I guess.
Yeah, and we had a blast.
We did. Yeah.
Do you want to go into it a
Well,
little more?
you know, I think that it was something that really has kind of been perpetuated, because I think it sort of kicked off interest in Helena's history. And maybe partly because of the quarries, a lot of other things have happened here in town. A lot of other people have become interested, and other things have been written. Other writers have taken up, you know, the Helena history cause, I guess. So I think in a way, you know, it really did sort of pave the way for a lot of other things that happened. But thanks to Dave Shores, who was the editor at the Independent Record at the time, he sort of was the leader.
Right.
And he sort of helped us all, you know, get into the swing of doing this weekly thing. And for 5 years, we did it every single week. I think I was the organizer. I tracked down a lot of different people to contribute, and it really was a lot of fun, but it was a lot of work too. And the first volume of More from the Quarries actually was published because of Bruce Wittenberg, who's, of course, now our director at the Historical Society, but he was at that time the publisher of the Independent Record. And because of him, we have 3 volumes of the quarries that were collected. But there were some stories that never did get into the volumes, because we were still writing them. When Volume 3 came out, we were still writing the column. And I think John had some, and I had some that really never did get collected.
Well, that's true, and I got to mention too, we put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into each one of those columns. There was a lot of discussion between Ellen and I over the course of the thing about how to approach certain subjects and what we should really be concentrating on, and we did this all for $10 a column.
Yeah.
Which wasn't very much money then either. But,
I think actually it was $7 a column.
was it $7?
$7 a column, yeah.
It was good for a meal at McDonald's.
Yeah, yeah.
And once in a while. But one thing that I really liked about the quarries in any case is because we were all historians. And in the case of Rich Rader, you know, he was one of my professors at MSU. And it was great working with everybody as colleagues rather than as student teachers or whatever. And I think we really produced some good stuff during that time. But like Ellen says, there was a lot of things that didn't make it into the books, or else they made it into the books and we found out later that, or at least I found out later, I was wrong at a few spots.
History is always evolving, you know, we'll never know everything, and we all make mistakes, and, you know, it's part and parcel of doing the kind of work that we do, I think.
Yeah, but except for this book, it's the new one, it's perfect. So there are no mistakes. So
we did when we decided to do this particular volume, we did decide to dedicate it to the four members of the quarries that have since passed away. And so we do want to remember Vivian Paladin and Harriet Malloy, Dave Walter, and Rich Rader. And 3 of those folks, you know, were past employees of the Montana Historical Society too. So Rich was a professor at MSU, so he had a special chair though at the library that he. And
I made sure never to occupy it when he showed up. Because he would let you know very quickly that was his chair. How did we go back?
Wait a minute, I don't know how we go back. There we go.
Yeah.
There we go.
So the current book, we kind of took some of those things that we'd worked on before, had a chance to correct them and expand on them, and maybe approach it from a different direction than we had originally, and added new things in there that had caught our interest over the ensuing 20 years since the last column had been published. And so this book is a collection of 20 stories that is kind of a mixture of old and new history that we hope you'll all be interested in. And I hope, you know, as much as I think it's perfect, there's bound to be a mistake or two in there. Of course, they're all hers. I'm just kidding. Ellen and I have been friends for so long, she's more like family than anything else. So anyway, so we thought tonight we'd kind of go through the book very quickly and just kind of talk about why we chose the subjects that we did. And we'll leave a few minutes at the end for any questions, and then we'll go on and get writer's cramp, signing all your copies tonight, hopefully. I am the transportation historian for the Department of Transportation, and so I've kind of developed a real interest in old roads and where they went and how they were built. And of course, one of the primary routes from anywhere, you know, Helena was really the hub of a lot of different roads during the frontier days, and the most important of those being the Benton Road. And the Benton Road, of course, provided a connection between Helena and Fort Benton on the upper Missouri River. But there's also a lot of misconceptions on that road, especially when it reaches Helena.
You want to go to the map?
Go to the next one. There we go. The image on the right is a copy of the original map that was done, General Land Office map that was done of the Helena Valley, and it shows a lot of these different roads that existed out there in about 1868 when this map was done. One thing that we always get questions about, both Ellen and I, is why was, about Benton Avenue? Was Benton Avenue a part of the Benton Road? And I'll say unequivocally tonight, no, it was not. It had a different name for a long time, and it was named for Thomas Hart Benton, who was a Missouri senator who was real instrumental in promoting the settlement of the American West before the Civil War. And so I think the road deserved another look. I had made a mistake in the original book. I had said, or the article, I said that 10 Mile Creek got its name because it was 10 miles from Helena. And a man who's since passed away never let me forget the fact that that was wrong. And for the last 20-some years, that fact in that book has bothered me. So we corrected that in this book. But I just wanted to give you a taste of what it looked like in downtown Helena at one time. The road was narrow then on the gulch like it is now. And probably a lot of you have been down there during the early morning delivery times and found that navigating Last Chance Gulch was just as difficult today as it was in 1865, except the road's not dirt anymore. And there are no Chinese tunnels under it. I had to get that in. All right, now it's your turn.
Okay, so, oops, well, why is it skipping there? Okay, so a few years ago, I did a lecture on the Sieben Ranch, and some of you probably heard me talk about that. I think it's a really important place. It has a very, very long history, beginning with, was a travel corridor for the earliest populations, really. And so I sort of turned that into an article, a written article, just because I think that history is important. And Malcolm Clark, that you see there, also, is a very important figure in territorial history. One of the original members of the Montana Historical Society, a charter member, and unfortunately was murdered in 1869, and a lot of the problems, I think, stemmed from misunderstandings from his murder. But the history of the Sieben Ranch continues to today. So I think it is an important place, and of course the history of the Sleeping Giant also, which started out to be the bear's tooth, and basically the tooth, there were two noses. And when the tooth fell in 1878 during an earthquake, people forgot about the bear's tooth, which had been a landmark for Lewis and Clark even. And when the bear's tooth was gone, it took almost 20 years for somebody to notice that that looks like a sleeping giant. And since about 1893, it's been known as a sleeping giant. But that, I think, is an important story for Helena. So here's your next one here.
I assume all of you have seen this photo before, mainly because it's on the cover of the book as well. But this has also always been a photograph that's intrigued me. This is Wood Street that street is it? State Street
State
today.
Street.
And Wood Street was Helena's first business district.
Miller,
What was that?
Bridge Street, you mean?
Bridge Street, I'm sorry. Yep, I'm sorry, I got Wood Street. Yeah, yeah. It's all right in the book, believe me. So, but this photograph always intrigued me because, not only because of the activity on the street, but the different architectural styles of the buildings that lined it, the freight wagons that are located there that were likely mule-drawn and were carrying perishable goods and not the more dry goods that would have required the ox-pulled wagons. Those guys standing along the street, I always wondered, I wonder what ever happened to them, who they were, whatever happened to them, what they were talking about while they were standing there kibitzing way back in 1865. And there was actually 2 photographs that went along with that. This is at the lower end of Bridge Street. And the Highland City Meat Market, I believe, belonged to Conrad Coors, who later went on to be really Montana's first major cattle baron. But again, got a dog in the photo. You can't ever beat that. And so it was just to kind of look at this and talk about how Helena has really evolved. And especially in that last photo, if you notice up on the left-hand side, you can see the top of that tree poking up there, that is the hanging tree that, of course, we all know about. And there aren't that many photographs of it. And, of course, we got this one in the background, so you kind of get an idea how close that was to Helena's business district at one time. All right. Another subject that's always fascinated me as well, and one that I'm still researching today, is the Frenchwoman's Road. The original road over McDonald Pass was established in 1867, and mostly what it was known for and how it got its name was because of the woman who ran the toll house on the west side of the divide, just about, not too far outside of Elliston on this side. And we don't know much about her other than the fact she was a good cook. She didn't speak English very well. She was probably from France, hence Frenchwoman, and she was murdered. And that's about all we know. And one thing that I'm going to pursue until I can't do it anymore is it really bothers me that we don't know what her first name was. She's just the Frenchwoman or Madame Guillot. So there's also a ghost story involved with it that happened at her old roadhouse years after her death. And it's just a nice photograph of the sign that's up on McDonald Pass now. So, we all know McDonald Pass, but we don't always know the history of it. And so this gives you a real good sense, I hope, of how important that route was and how it's been steeped in Montana folklore for 150 years.
So I always wanted to write about Seth Bullock because I think that people have misinformation about him. If you watch the series Deadwood, some of you probably watched the series. It starts out in Helena, starts out with Seth Bullock hanging a person by the name of Clell Watson. That person never existed. That is a total manufactured story told by some of his family, and I think that probably Seth himself manufactured that story. But what he really did while he was here in Helena, before there ever was a Deadwood, he was the sheriff here of Lewis and Clark County, and in 1875, he actually did preside over the first 2 legal hangings in the territory of Montana. And the story of those hangings is pretty interesting, which is what I tell in the story. But part of it has to do with a mistake that he made in building a fence around the gallows. He built this gallows that had 13 steps up to it, which was a traditional thing to do. The first person who was to be hanged was supposed to be hanged on Friday the 13th at 9 o'clock in the morning. He built a fence around the gallows because the public wasn't supposed to be able to view the hangings, and realized too late that the fence that he built around this gallows was not tall enough, and people could definitely see. So what he did was he changed the time from 9 o'clock in the morning to 1 minute after midnight, hoping that it would be a dark night. But unfortunately, the word got out. Hundreds and hundreds of people sat on the rooftops and watched this hanging by the light of the moon. But if you look at the map there, you can actually see the gallows. That number 5 is the jail that was there in 1878 on the same site that the Myrna Loy is on today. And in the back of that, you can see a gallows, and you can actually see the fence around it, which is kind of a cool discovery. So.
Right, next one. Another thing that I've always been interested in is roadhouses and stage stations. Mainly because everybody, well, for the last 30 years, I get phone calls at least once or twice a year about, well, I'm living in an old stage station. What can you tell me about it? Well, if you listen to them, most of the people in the rural areas of Montana are living in old stage stations, which isn't quite true. But one that we did find out about, it's a roadhouse, and this was something that Dr. Rich Buswell had first clued us in on. 7 Mile House. This was located on 7 Mile Creek, which was 7 miles from Silver City, excuse me. And today, the building sits just north of where the Bird's Eye Road crosses the railroad tracks. And you can drive by it when you drive up Bird's Eye Road. But researching 7 Mile House, it had a really interesting history, not so much with the people who ran it honestly, of course, but with the people who ran it dishonestly. And one of my favorite stories that I read about was a man named Andrew Gold, who ran it for a while. He was a former soldier at Fort Shaw. I have a feeling he might have been involved in the Baker Massacre in 1870. But he married a woman who was much older than he was, and she had grown children. And Mr. Gold apparently was having an affair with one of her children. And she had a baby, and for some reason they tried to extort money from Gold's mining partner by claiming that he had despoiled his stepdaughter's daughter. And it was all false. It was an attempt just to get money out of them. And the guy complained about it, took it to court, and they all had to kind of admit what they were doing. But what came through in the court testimony was the story of a very dysfunctional family, to say the least. And Gold, however, had also stopped a fight before with the previous owner, who had attempted to cheat a Chinese guy out of his savings. And it turned out the Chinese man was a better poker player than the owner of the 7 Mile House. And so the owner decided, pistol whipped the Chinese guy. I keep wanting to say Chinaman, and that's not the way we're supposed to be saying. But pistol whipped him, threatened him, took a couple shots at him. And the property owner actually went to jail for it, and the newspaper supported the Chinese man through all this, which I think was probably fairly unusual at that time. So 7 Mile House and this decrepit false front building along Bird's Eye Road had a rather checkered history that, again, most people wouldn't have known anything about unless there was some research done on it. It would just be an interesting place to look at as you drove by.
So a couple of years ago, I was invited to do a history of the public library here, and that was really a tough piece of research. And so I thought that it would be a good idea to sort of turn that into an article, because I think people should read about our library, know the really long history that it does have. Probably some of you remember when it was in the what's now the Grand Street Theater. Probably some of you remember that. And some of you probably know that it was at the City Auditorium, pictured here also. But the story actually also allowed me to tell one of the great dramatic stories of one of the fires that burned much of Last Chance Gulch, the south end of Last Chance Gulch. So that figures in the story, and how the early records were lost, which I think is a really one of Helena's probably most dramatic episodes. And Harriet Sanders is the person who saved quite a few papers, but she didn't save the first run of the newspapers, which is why we don't have them in the library today because of that fire. And it's also interesting that in the course of doing this research, I discovered that during the fire, the place where the library was located is right where the current library is located. And so that's kind of an interesting little sidelight. And then a lot of you know that prostitutes and ghosts are my two of my major interests. And this fence at Benton Avenue Cemetery has always really, really intrigued me. My friend Charlene Spalding, who wrote a book about Benton Avenue Cemetery and did a lot of research, came across some information about Agnes and also about Fanny Spencer, who's buried in the plot next to her. We have a pretty fantastic record of the possessions of these women because when they died, they had no wills, so it went into probate, and there is pretty extensive lists of their possessions. And so it always did intrigue me, and so that figures in this particular story. And I've always found it really interesting that Agnes Merrill's gate features on the corners pineapples. You guys know what pineapples stand for. In the South, pineapples mean welcome. And so it kind of stands to reason that given who she was, she would really appreciate people to come and visit her. And, you are welcome to do that. So I guess I have 3 in a row here, don't I? And also, one of the old Quarries articles that I had done many, many years ago was a story about the House of the Good Shepherd, which is that very strange little collection of buildings on the corner of Hoback, and it's between 8th and 9th on Hoback. And actually that is listed in the National Register. The building on the left-hand side there is the studio of Tim Holmes, the sculptor. And on the right-hand side, that is the House of the Sisters of the Good Shepherd Convent. And anyway, the story is about neighbors and the problems that happened when one of the neighbors had a daughter who he believed was wayward. The purpose of the house was to rehabilitate prostitutes, basically. But the sisters took in all kinds of juveniles who were sent there by the court, and also women who were drug addicts, women who wanted to reform in one way or another, alcoholics. And so when one of the neighbors' teenage daughter supposedly became wayward, he placed her there, and it caused a lot of trouble in the neighborhood, and that's basically what the story is about. But when the House of the Good Shepherd then moved out of town, moved out to the west side, Dundee, what's her name, Wagner? Dundee, the lady who has the barbershop next to my office. Warden. Okay, that's right. I never know her by her last name. Anyway, she gave me this photograph, which is the cemetery, and some of you may have heard or may have taken walks up there when there was actually a cemetery. The only piece of the House of the Good Shepherd out on the west side that is left today is St. Andrew's School, which was the later gymnasium. But there was a cemetery there, and this was taken in the early 1990s. Now there are houses built over that cemetery.
All right. This is one of the crazy chapters. And I'm thinking probably my friends Tom and Debbie might remember when all this happened, way back in the spring of 1976. I remember reading it in the newspaper about big feet being seen out in the field next to Canyon Ferry Road, just to the east of the intersection of York Road. And the story was always kind of, Bigfoot, really? But it kind of went along with a winter and spring of a lot of odd sightings, not only in Helena, but throughout this whole area that was kind of tied to that whole idea of cattle mutilations. So, and I remembered this story. Some kid woke up without his glasses on, looked out the window for some reason, and saw these two things in the field just east of his house. Went to tell his dad, who didn't really want to get out of bed and look. And didn't seem to be any real proof that they were there until his sister went out in the field and found a footprint or two and took plaster casts of them. And then all of a sudden, these hairy aliens garnered some more serious attention from Keith Wolverton, who was the sheriff in Cascade County, who came down and interviewed him and thought the boy was telling the truth. And whether he was or not, I don't know. He's never been back. I tried to track down the boy, which he would have been about my age. I was 18 at the time this happened. But mostly what I remember was working at Butchery Foods. How many of you remember Butchery's? And a lot of people were a little bit nervous about what had happened out there, which of course just made it all the more interesting to me. But my parents thought I was nuts. I told my mother once when she says, "Well, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And I said, "I wanted to be a UFOologist." I think I was half kidding her, but anyway, it was. She still reminds me of that too. Another thing that I've really become interested in lately has been the airway beacons. And I think any of you that have lived here in Helena for a long time have kind of grown used to the lights flashing from the hills around town, correct? And those were all part of a system that was at one time nationwide to guide pilots across the country at night. But by the first years of the 21st century, it wasn't. It was obsolete. It wasn't needed. Yet Montana was the only state in the union that was still maintaining these beacons. And at one point here just recently, the cost of maintaining them was becoming cost prohibitive for the aeronautics division from the MDT. So they decided to decommission them. But because they're state-owned historic properties, that I needed to do the research on them. And what was coming through was something that was utterly fascinating to me. And right now I've got a beacon sitting in my office. And I tried to bring it home. My wife said no. But she didn't think it would look good in the living room. But the history of the beacons is really tied in pretty closely to the history of aviation in Montana and in Helena. So these are photographs. The one on the left is McDonald Pass, which many of you have probably zeroed in on that light when you're driving on US 12 coming home late at night. It kind of provides a beacon even for automobiles. And the other one is at Stony Point, north in the North Valley, and we recently gave that to the property owner, and she restored it, and it's lighting the way again. And I saw the light when I was going home from work earlier today. So the beacons, they're not going anywhere. They're going to stay. There's only one that's going to be dismantled, but the rest of them are going to stay in place, and many of them will be lighted once again. Another thing that's always, has been an interest of mine for the last several years is the Ground Observer Corps. And I've been here before in this room talking about it to an audience like yourselves. Many of you probably you were there. But what I talk about in this particular chapter is the fact that Helena had one of the two filter centers in the state of Montana. And the filter centers are where the observers in the field would call in sightings. And the people who worked in the centers would plot those airplanes on boards so they could see what route they were taking, whether they, and hopefully in the process, make the determination whether they were friend or foe. Of course, they were all friend. But Helena Filter Center was originally located in the high school building, the old high school there on Logan, I believe, is it?
Oh,
Warren, yeah.
Next to Central School.
Yeah, next to Central School. And then because that building was really not very suitable to this kind of activity, they moved it to the 4th floor of the Montana Club building. And just, I think there was a lot of coincidences there because the major players in the Filter Center were all women. They were all wives of Helena lawyers for the most part, and who were all members of the Montana Club. So, but the Filter Center was active in Helena from 1951 until 1958, when it was shut down and its operations consolidated with the center in Billings. But reading about the Filter Center here in Helena was like reading about a who's who of Helena matrons. And so an interesting story that's been nearly forgotten, and one I've just been in contact with a woman back east about maybe getting the ground observers some kind of recognition on a national level for the work they did during the 1950s. There's another view of the interior of the Filter Center. I believe this is in the Montana Club. All right.
So also a few years ago, I was asked to research the history of St. Peter's Hospital and to address their volunteers. And again, it took a lot of work. It was really a shame to sort of put it aside and not share that information. So that's also a chapter here in the book. And I think it is interesting, and probably some of you remember when the old hospital was over on Logan Street, and the first one, built in 1885, 1886, was built on the tailing piles, and there's not a bit of vegetation around it. And then different buildings were added. But the main campus was designed by Cass Gilbert. I think people don't really know that. Cass Gilbert was a designer of the Montana Club, and he designed the plan of the campus and also the landscaping that was there. That campus was used until I think about 1964, if I'm correct, and then the hospital moved out to where it is now. The only piece of the old hospital complex that still exists is the education center for St. Paul's Methodist Church, and that was a dormitory, the nurses' dormitory. And so that little piece was connected to the hospital and is still there today. And then, of course, having been one of the co-curators of the Chinese exhibit here, I'm sure a lot of you saw that. It's really inspired me to do a lot of research on the Chinese, and communities really have a hard time letting go of some of the myths. And I know that there are people who swear that they saw opium beds underneath the end of South Main Street when they did urban renewal and excavated down there. And it's true that there probably were beds against the walls, but those places were used for boarding houses because there were a lot of workers and space was at a premium. Basement spaces were much cheaper to rent than above ground. And opium dens in particular were hardly ever located in basements. They were in regular buildings, first and second floors, usually next to the police station. Almost in many communities here in Helena, that was true. It was true in Havre and other places too. And they weren't clandestine like we think. Everybody knew where they were. A lot of people smoked opium. A lot of people besides the Chinese smoked opium. And so anyway, dispelling some of those myths has sort of become a passion with me. And Crystal Shores was nice enough to give me a menu from Yat San's, which is one of the generational Chinese businesses that still exists here in Montana. And of course we have China Row, which is outside the tended bounds of the cemetery, where about 200 Chinese people are buried. And there's some myths associated with that as well. And then the beautiful altar that some of you may have seen if you came to the exhibit was on the bottom of it, it has a Clore Street address. Clore Street is now Park Street. And the address is the building that used to be right next door to the Pioneer Cabin, which is a really interesting thing. So anyway, the article sort of, or the story deals with all of that.
How we doing for time, Kirby?
Good.
You doing all right?
We probably should wrap it up.
Okay, I'll go really fast with this guy because I've been dreading that Kurt Sinnis was going to write an article in the Independent Record
Before
before the book came
Scoop
out.
you, huh?
Yeah, I already got scooped on one of my chapters that I didn't want to get scooped, especially on this one. This is a gentleman named Leroy Clayton. He went by the name King Kong Clayton in the pro wrestling circuit in the late 1930s and 1940s. I'd first heard about this guy when I was a judge for the Vigilante Parade. When I first started doing that, I had to sit there with Dave Walter, who was very quiet, but our other two judges were Cato Butler and Bob Morgan, who, as you can imagine, were not quiet. And Bob used to tell this story every year about this guy named King Kong Clayton who would perform at his bar. They would have, he had a couple of ropes with nooses on the end, so you can imagine I had a problem. How am I going to write this up for the chapter? And he would have those two nooses put around his neck, and they'd have guys pulling on these ropes from two different directions. And then the goal was to see how long King Kong could withstand that before they pulled him over. And so they would bet on that. And apparently the way Bob told it was, well, King Kong Clayton didn't have a neck, so those nooses just came right up over his head all the time. But you can see in the photograph that he actually did have a neck. But he was, on the wrestling circuit in the Pacific Northwest through the latter part of the 30s and into the 40s. He was known as a clean wrestler, and they usually had him in matches against the villains. And if you lived in Helena, every Wednesday night, you could go to either the Shrine Auditorium or some other venue and watch a whole evening of professional wrestling, which, of course, is a sport that doesn't exist here in Helena anymore. So I wrote up about King Kong Clayton. Apparently his family still lives here in Montana. They live down in Billings. They don't have the best memories of their father, but one thing I did get out of all this is King Kong was somebody I would really like to have met. I mean, he sounds like a neat guy and a decent man and a good wrestler who was, pretty well, associated with Helena for many years during the Great Depression.
So some of you probably have heard me talk about the Temple Emmanuel, which is now the Office of the Catholic Diocese, and also the Home of Peace, which is Helena's oldest active cemetery, founded in about 1867, the Jewish cemetery tucked in behind Capitol High School over there. And I'm not going to say anything more about that, but it is an interesting story. The Jewish community made a lot of contributions to early Helena, and their story is pretty compelling, I think.
All right, I'll go very quick through this. You've all seen the lime kilns on South or West Main Street there at Grizzly Gulch and Orofino Gulch.
Did we miss one?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
We did. Oh, you want to go?
Yeah.
Okay.
So lime producing was really an important industry at Helena at one time because they used it for a lot of different purposes in building, for mortar, for plaster, for whitewash, that type of thing. And Helena was fortunate to be located right near a very suitable outcrop of Madison limestone that worked for doing that. So this article, or this chapter, just talks about the importance of that particular industry, and I wanted to talk a little bit about this particular lime kiln. I grew up not too far from this place on the Upper East Side, and we spent a lot of time there as kids and didn't really know what it was used for. But if you go up there now, this is all that remains of it. But the whole operation is all right there. The kiln, an older kiln that was probably used about a decade before this one was built. The limestone quarry is still very obvious in the hillside behind it, and the road going down the gulch that they used to get it to the building site, which in this case was the old high school on Warren Street. This one was built specifically in 1891 to produce lime for the construction of that building.
So the editor said to me, you have to put a couple of ghost stories in the book. You have to. So Tony Wilson and his partner Steve Faherty very kindly shared their house story. They have a wonderful duplex over on Holter Street, and these are just some of the artifacts that came out of their house, but they have a pretty good story, which they shared with me. I won't tell it, but...
I think this is my last one in the book, isn't it?
It is.
All right. Many of you might also remember when aliens landed out at Canyon Ferry Village in 1964. My dad first told me the story, and it's a great story. You know, it's spooky and keeping very much in the times that this happened, but it's important to remember that it was all a hoax. But at the time, you know, people had a tendency to believe the kids that saw it, and I was surprised in researching it at their parents were very supportive of them and the stories they were telling, but it did turn out to be a hoax. There should have been a lot of clues right at the very beginning of why it was a hoax, but they were all kind of missed at first in the sensationalism of the event. And I just wanted to, again, bring it back to public memory, the whole story about the flying saucer hoax at Canyon Ferry. And I guess that's all I have to say about it.
Okay. Finally, the last story is about Bryant School, the old Bryant School. This is the first Bryant School that was torn down in about 1912. The story came about really because the teachers over there called me over, and all of the teachers gathered a couple of years ago, and they were telling me about all of these odd things that were happening in the school. Even the kids were excited about the school being haunted. Everybody knew about it. Everybody knew all the things that were going on. And it seemed to start, you know, when they began to talk about building the new Bryant School and tearing this one down. And so a lot of research later, we did discover that one of the individuals is probably Mr. John Black, who was the custodian there from 1929 until 1962. And he lived through several incarnations of two different Bryant schools, and always smoked a cigar and always wore a hat. And there was this plaque that was dedicated to him at the base of the flagpole. I don't know if they kept that plaque or if they kept the flagpole. But the current janitor who works at night told me that he, as they were building the new school, he would look across the way there at night, and he could see some figure in the new building, and he said it always looked like this figure was sort of beckoning to him. And so the question is, did Mr. Black or whoever it is move to the new building? And that question is still unanswered. So that really kind of wraps it up for us. We hope that you have enjoyed some of these stories. We hope that you'll enjoy actually reading them.
That we sparked your interest in them a little bit.
So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Oh, sure, we can do a couple of questions, yeah. Anybody have any? Oh, nobody wants to say anything.
I guess we'll sign both.
We'll see you out in the hall then, huh? Yeah.
John Black always wore big overalls too.
Did he? Well, they've been smelling.